Scruton, February 13th, 1981. Before we begin, would you like to give a brief background of when you first came to Ball State?
Well, yeah, sure. I came here in the fall term of 1954 from the University of Washington, and I was pretty much fresh out of graduate school then, to the social science department. There wasn't any anthropology department then, or sociology, or those. It was a single department: history, political science, sociology, anthropology, economics. Five current departments in what was then only one, and there were only 9 of us in the department, which gives you an idea. I'm being interviewed.
Terribly. Sorry to interrupt. I just have a quick question.
Flip your. That's how the leopard came to have its spots. Yeah. So when the time that you're talking about had come, I had been here 15 or 16 years already.
So when would you say the beginning of the peace movement, as far as student activities, evolved on the campus?
Late 69, 70. My recollection of it, you see, is that the peak of it was centered around Kent State. Now, I do recall that there was an alternative newspaper.
The only alternative?
Yeah, I guess that was it, wasn't it? I hadn't thought about that in years. What you say about Barbara is correct. Things do kind of come back to you. It was being handed out outside the, no, I guess you paid a little bit for it, maybe, whatever. Over in the student, I can remember coming through the gallery way in the student center, and it was there. And it caused a bit of a fuss. I can recall that some of the administration was, and probably some faculty too, were upset. But I couldn't put a date on that. Was that right around Kent State, or a little bit later, a little bit earlier? But kind of the terminal Vietnam years. So I would have thought that whatever went on here was concentrated in the Kent State era.
Muncie is generally given a conservative type stereotype. Do you feel that Muncie reacted very strongly to the students?
I don't believe so. There were a few, I can't remember this, letters to the editor. You know, every time something happens here, someone will write a letter to the editor. What are they doing out there? But I don't believe there was enough activity that it engendered any particular reaction or backlash that I can recall.
Mm-hmm.
But it would have been chiefly in newspapers, maybe some editorials. Muncie isn't a very coherent community, you know. I mean, it's my impression, it is extremely conservative, or the people are. But I don't think there's any community of purpose exactly. There'd be no particular way for feelings of that sort to express themselves except through casual letter to the editor sort of thing. Maybe a few sermons, I don't know. No, I don't think so, not very much. Whatever went on was pretty largely what went on here.
Mm-hmm. You made a comment a little while ago about the administration being a little upset about the only alternative being passed out.
I do remember that. If you're going to have to refer to details, I can't remember what. Dean of Student Affairs. You know, it's just that subliminal recollection. I had a file of those. I thought they would be kind of interesting to hang on to. And so I got one from time to time. I don't know how many I had. It wasn't a particularly well-done newspaper, you understand. I'm sure that a journalist would have had a fit about it. But I kept those, and then when we moved, we used to be housed in an office. Now that's interesting because the time perspective is changing in my mind. When the Kent State affair occurred, we were in East Quad as a section of sociology. But I think when I was collecting the newspaper, we were in our offices on McKinley, North McKinley, 320 North McKinley, or 303, I guess it was. And that was a year later. I'm sorry, I just cannot put it together. And my recollection of the upsetness of the administration is only that. Just someone probably mentioned to me that the dean of students was upset. I'm not sure if they tried to deny them a place to pass out or sell their newspaper or not. You may have picked that up from someone else. I guess maybe they didn't. No. It was kind of an inflammatory thing. I wish I knew what happened to those copies. I've got stuff in boxes in my closets there. They're probably stuck down there somewhere. I don't think I would have thrown those away because I have kind of a fondness for historical mementos, and they were. Darn.
On October 15, 1969, several groups, the Peace Treaty Organization and Veterans for Peace, persuaded Ball State to have a Vietnam moratorium day. Do you have any recollections of this? It was to consist of 24 hours of marathon lectures and teach-ins.
Yeah, but I must be kind of a non-participant. I remember the event, but I'm not a goer to things of that sort. Yeah. Did that also have to do with some marches? Was that at the same time? Or were those civil rights? There were some marches on Riverside. Have you run across that from anyone yet? I must be an observer of the scene or something. I knew a lot of people at the time who took part of them. Everett Farrell in history, I can remember, did. And there was more hullabaloo than I thought. Damn. I'm sorry, I do remember the moratorium. I do indeed, but I did not participate in it. Mm-hmm. And but I recall the 24-hour business. Yeah. I'm afraid I'm purely reactive. No original data is going to come out of me, except that movie.
Do you have any recollections of the teach-ins that were occurring?
Well, since I didn't go to any, and since none were held in my classes, you see, I think part of the reason I'm not going to be terribly useful to you is that I personally was extremely ambivalent. Mm-hmm. It wasn't. I had not taken either internally a strong anti-war position, or the contrary. I mean, neither a hawk nor a dove. I can remember I wavered very much, kind of like the country did in a way. Mm-hmm. And I had a bit of disagreement with my own son then. He was finishing high school in 69, 70. And I can recall we would argue. Kids at that age, it was obviously my opinion, didn't have the perspective, so it seemed to me, from which to see whether or not our involvement with the war was reasonable or not. And I was also a political admirer of Lyndon Johnson. It's the truth of the matter. And an awful lot of the time, I can remember being convinced that although it was an unfortunate thing to be in, I couldn't very well see how we could be other than in it. So I was not a sympathetic observer of the moratoria and the teach-ins and the whole thing. Not completely unsympathetic, but I certainly didn't rush with open arms to take part. And consequently, those things just kind of went by, you know. Yes, there they are, and there obviously was more excitement among some than I would remember. I would think among such as Aker, the student, obviously, or perhaps John Barber, who obviously was here then, but a much younger man than I, and no doubt more personally swept up in it. I wasn't an anti-war type. I was scared to death my own son would have to go, and there was a lot of talk in my own household just at that time about the Canadian alternative, which some took, and I think my wife and I were not in full agreement about that. Part of the trouble, I wonder, this is all terribly personal, it's not what you want at all, I suppose, but I can only lay out how I felt. I was a part of the Second World War generation, you see, and which was a very popular war. My own father had served in the First World War as a medical officer, and when the Second World War began, he was 65 years old in 1941, just about 65. Even so, he rushed down to try to re-enlist, and of course they said, "Thank you kindly, why don't you just stay home?" I can recall how angry he was when he came back that they wouldn't take him again. He'd been a colonel in the First World War, and I expect he thought he'd be a general in the Second. And so the household was an intensely patriotic one, and the Second World War was right. It was dead right. I mean, those other people were wicked people, and there was great enthusiasm. My brother was in the Navy, and though the family was frightened for him, obviously, it was a big thing. And the worst fear that younger kids, such as I in high school, had was that the war would be over before we got in it. And you didn't want to miss it. Now, granted, that was high school foolishness and all that, but we wanted it. My closest friend and I in high school left high school a year early in order that we could get 1 year of college in. We left before graduating from high school. So we could get a year of college in so that when we went, we would have a better chance of being generals or whatever we thought. And the war ended just before we got in. We were bitterly disappointed. So the whole conception of an opposition to American involvement was something that was a bit peculiar to me, and I obviously never took to it entirely. Clearly the thing was going badly and all of that, but I'm not sure I ever persuaded myself that our being there was as great a moral misfortune as a lot of other people did. So I just kind of hung around on the sides, and many of these things just went by me. I may even be concealing my own memory of having been more negative than that. Maybe I poo-pooed them, but now I can't remember how intensely I felt about it. So I participated in none of those things. Absolutely none of them.
Well,
I wish I had, for your sake. It'd be great to have minutes from them and campaign buttons and to have been involved in the thick of it and the like. But there really was a difference of opinion, a perfectly honorable one. Quite clearly, the people who thought it was a terrible thing for us to be there spoke from profoundest conviction. And people who thought we should be there spoke from profound conviction. It was a very screwed up country. I presume, imagine historians are pretty clear on that. It may well, except for the Civil War, have been the most divisive period in our history, I can imagine. Certainly the most so that I remember. Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of looking off into memory.
That's fine. In response to the Vietnam Moratorium Day, a residence hall, Beeman Hall, wrote the President Nixon, and pledged their support in his actions no matter what they might be. And this was rather radical considering, here they were in the midst of a campus that was preparing for a moratorium.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any recollections of that. Or maybe...
Wonder if the letter appeared in the Daily News.
It went...
Well, I've no doubt I would have read it, but it would have been simply one more thing at the time. I wonder how many, do you know how many people signed it? Or was it?
There were close to 200 signatures.
Were there really?
In the end, I think.
And do you by any chance have any notion what the size of the population was that actively participated in the demonstrations, the anti-war stuff?
Not all of them.
What I was going to guess was that Ball State being Ball State, and I think I'm absolutely right in this, the bulk being pretty apathetic, that there was probably quite a small active majority for whom the president was naturally right, and the spokesman of everybody, and probably not a much differently sized cadre of activists taking the opposite position. It's been that way with most things at Ball State. Excitement, like student government, tends to be restricted to enough people that most of them could get in this room, and the great mass have never been very interested in anything. I do not recall that, no. Don't recall it at all. But I would have noted
Do
it
you
at the
recall
time.
any anti-war movement?
Don't at all, except that when those marches took place, there was a good deal of catcalling and threat making from people along the side, but those were townspeople, I think, for whom the university, in many ways, has always been slightly weird, you know, as so often happens. There's nothing unusual about that. No, I recall nothing whatsoever about opposition on the campus, except obviously from what you say, there was some expression of support for the administration. It would have been pretty late then for there to have been many veterans around who might have been angered by it. After all, the Korean War was over in 1952, so that veterans from that affair had gone through college and were long disappeared. And it might have been from such that there would have been opposition to the anti-war types. No, I do not recall. The interest was all focused, this I know quite clearly, was all focused on the opposition to the war, because it was rather focal and did produce that newspaper and that nice running back and forth across the oval.
There was a strike in May of 1970, the first week of May, as a matter of fact, and the Student Senate and approximately 300 students and faculty were involved in it.
Yes, sir. I do remember that, too. How good of you to remind me of these things. That there was a good deal of chatter about, but I did not participate. No.
Do you remember how widespread it was? Or?
I think it was sort of a fizzle, but that simply may not be true. Among colleagues of mine, there was I think there was no participation at all. And I do think I remember when the day came that there were very few students in my classes who were evidently missing because of that. Yeah, I do remember it. Yeah, and I things like that not exactly annoyed me, but I guess I thought they were kind of silly. I'm pretty sure I thought they were kind of silly, in fact. Gee, I forgot that too. I want to be sure and see a copy of your paper and relive those glorious days of yesteryear.
It was during this time that they wanted the strike, that they had the May Day march in Washington, D.C.
Some people went. I had a few students who went. I could not give you their names. That's too many years, and too many students have gone by since then. But I had a few who went. There were insignias or something, and they came back wearing them. A few anthropology students, as a matter of fact. Anthropology students often used to tend at least to be, sometimes on the radical fringe of things. It was just a tradition. If you were an anthropologist, you were supposed to be that way. And we did have a few. Shoot, I wish I could remember the names. But yeah, I remember them going.
Do you remember any of the responses or the reactions of administration toward students taking time out of school to do that?
No, I don't think there was any. I don't believe. The Ball State has never had a policy about people who are gone from class, you see. Never have had. Each individual instructor creates his own. And I'm reasonably confident that there wasn't any active response from the administration. Damn it, if there was, I'm disappointed. I don't think so.
Okay. You were talking about Kent State and how the students reacted on campus earlier. Elaborate on that a little?
I can remember, I was really upset. Everyone was. I think I can remember coming to school the next day, and everyone was kind of stunned. It wasn't very far away, after all. We weren't in the same athletic conference at the time. No, I'm sure we weren't. Well, I'm not sure what we were in, but it wasn't that. So there wasn't the sense of immediacy because it was a sister school or anything, but it was so close. And this was a little different after all. It wasn't a case of whether you thought the war was a good thing or a bad thing. It just seemed so horrible. Yeah, everyone was, I can remember being terribly distressed. I think I wore an armband. There was a day, there was to be kind of a mourning day. I actually did, yeah, surprised myself. When everyone who felt like it wore an armband. And I did wear one. Someone had given it to me. I don't know whom, a student, I suppose. And I wore it all day. I suppose I felt quite proud of myself. Oh, God. Now that was a shocker because it was so close and it seemed so clear a case of either stupidity or just plain murder. It was pretty horrible. I did not see the other evening the television movie about it. Did you watch it? Oh, it's this last week, an hour and a half, 2 hour long thing, movie version of that. And my wife watched it, but I deliberately went away. I did not want to. It seemed so unspeakable that those poor kids, I think 2 or 3 of them had nothing to do with it at all anyway, but were simply wandering across campus, you know, and happened to get in the way of a bullet. Atrocious, absolutely atrocious. Of course, by then the war was over anyway. Really. Yeah. I can remember the sensation on the day. I can't tell you I saw 5 people standing here weeping or anything of that sort, but I can remember very clearly the feeling of frustration and anger and sorrow. Such a stupid, horrible thing that happened. And I can recall taking pleasure, in a sense, in wearing the armband, just to show how it felt. But I do not recall anything about specific memorial gatherings or anything of that sort. There may have been some, but I don't remember.
Do you think the mood of the Muncie community as a whole changed toward Ball State after Kent State?
Changed toward Ball State?
Do you think they felt more hostile that the student body was protesting the war, or perhaps sympathized more with them?
Awful hard to... No, I don't think there was any sympathy. I mean, I don't think there was any overt or expressed sympathy. It's hard for me to separate any community attitude that might have been the result of the anti-war movement or Kent State or anything of that sort from what I think has been kind of characteristically the community attitude toward Ball State over a long period of time. When I came in before, the school was small, pretty small beer, as they used to say. The big employers were Ball Brothers, which was booming at the time, and Warner Gear, and Muncie Gear. It was an industrial town in 1954, and had always been. And Ball State didn't really amount to very much. It was tucked away in what they call Normal City. And I don't think anyone, when I came, really cared very much. We didn't count. But, and it may well have been about the same time, you'd need an economist to tell you this, two trends kind of coincided. The size of Ball State grew and grew and grew, and consequently its economic importance to the community grew and grew and grew, at the same time that the industrial base of Muncie was declining. Ball Brothers was shutting, Warner Gear was pulling in its horns, Muncie Gear closed. So the city began to fall kind of upon evil times, and now you see the result. It's got 17,000 students, must be 2,500 to 3,000 people work for it. It's by far the largest employer in Muncie. Take away Ball State and the town would dry up and blow away. Well, I think there's been a shift. It's my theory. I've had this for some time. And I'm not sure what part, if anything, this business would have played in it. That the more important Ball State has become, the greater has become a kind of not always suppressed resentment of it. When it isn't important, it doesn't matter. You don't resent something that isn't significant. You may be condescending, you may be slightly contemptuous, but you don't resent it. You resent something that perhaps reminds you of what was. And a number of us used to toy as this trend became obvious with the possibility that the more we grew, the more of the irritation at the community's diminished importance and our enhanced importance proceeded apace. But I can't relate that necessarily to 1970, let's say. And I can't say, I certainly was not conscious that I can remember of any specific expression of resentment because of what we were doing out here. But it would be worth spending half a day in the archives with the Muncie newspapers for editorial comment and letters to the editor. The letters to the editor column can be very interesting. I was all mixed up in the not in local politics, but I was being noisy myself in 1964 when the presidential campaign between Goldwater and Johnson was going on. Oh, sure. The Vietnam War was going on then, wasn't it? Though it wasn't really big then. I wrote a letter or two to the newspapers in opposition to Goldwater. Now, you understand his wife was a local girl, and he came from time to time. So my God, Goldwater could do no wrong. Muncie, the sun rose and set on Barry, and the newspaper never made any secret of its emotional commitment to Goldwater, and I just couldn't stand it after a while. Wrote a letter to the paper saying I thought the United Nations was a good thing, and it was the heyday of the get the U.S. out of the UN period, and that racism was a bad thing, and all that sort of stuff. And my word, the roof fell on me. You have no idea. Letters to the editor accusing me of being a communist and a socialist, and it was pretty clear that I was part of the academic community, and I think that betrayed to me some of the depth of the kind of community resentment of Ball State. But the Vietnam business was after that, and I certainly didn't propose myself as a champion of the anti-war movement or anything, as I might have done.
You were talking about Kent State earlier. When do you think the peace movement began fizzling out?
Well, I would have guessed that that Kent State day was the high point, but you probably could correct me. Or those street marches, I wish to God I could remember more about them, when they were. And I suppose I'm kind of sorry now. I didn't march in them. You know, it was right there at hand. I could have done, and I had a lot of friends who did. Whew. It's a little bit like people who wish they had gone to Alabama for the civil rights marches in 1960 or whatever, for Selma. And I can remember admiring. I think I approved of it, but I just wasn't a participant. I would have thought the spring of '70 was probably the high watermark. But isn't it kind of odd that the anti-war movement really was maybe reached its height when the intensity of the war itself was kind of winding down. It was really pretty clear from the time that Nixon became president that we were going to get ourselves out.
Do you
as
think
best
that's
we
more
could.
the Muncie community, the sense of the Muncie community, or being a little backward in the Northwest? Or?
No, I didn't thought. I certainly think the Muncie community is backward in many ways. No, I wouldn't have thought, I wouldn't have related it to Muncie in any specific sense.
Well, people have commented in the past that they thought that Muncie had been always a little behind, like 2 or 3 years behind.
Well, yes, I certainly, obviously, I do think that things tend to reach us sort of after they have got elsewhere. Did the war movement, anti-war movement, then reach us late, too? You'd know better about that than I.
Compared to other universities,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Ball State has not been in the forefront of movements. And the panty raid business is kind of trivial, I agree. But there you are. It was something that swept the country when I was still at the University of Washington. And I came here thinking that sort of thing, I presume it will be going on here. And it was years and years and years before anyone got around to it. I don't know. I would think more than the 2 or 3 that you mentioned, too. Indeed, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that we had picked up the anti-war movement after it had perhaps peaked elsewhere, or long after it had begun elsewhere. But memories, and I expect you will discover this when you're a bit older, of a decade or so before, there's a kind of distortion of time, and you're not likely to be sure whether 2 things that you can remember happened at the same time, or one was before the other, or vice versa. I just take for granted that we got everything after it was going on elsewhere, when Berkeley was on to something new, or Columbia and the sit-ins and so forth. We were just discovering with pleasure that form of entertainment. But I would guess, if someone were to pin me to the wall and say, when did the end of the anti-war excitement come, I would imagine that the spring of 70 would have been it. And I'll bet you the fall of 70 wasn't much, unless you've got evidence to the contrary.
Well, there was one event on May 5th, 1971, in which the Peace Treaty, the People's Peace Treaty Organization, and the Vietnam Veterans for Peace demonstrated in front of Beneficence. And about this time, at the Cooper Science Building, a tear gas bomb went off. And it took campus police close to half an hour to clear the building of all
the tear gas sounds familiar. I don't remember the Beneficence, and I couldn't, even if you had reminded me of the tear gas, I could not have told you that was 71. I simply couldn't have done it. No, I couldn't have told you a thing. I'm sorry.
Okay. Do you have any other recollections of any activities?
No, I don't. I really don't.
Guest speakers?
Because I wouldn't have gone, you see.
Mm-hmm.
I simply wouldn't have gone. It was something someone would make a comment about. I'm sure, I presume that people like John Barber were probably in the thick of it. John, I would have thought of as an activist sort. Ray White, probably. No, I'm sorry.
Do you have any recollection of when Nixon was inaugurated, the anti-inaugural ball that was given on the Arts Terrace in 73?
No, I was so sick about that in any case. No, that I would have gone to if I had remembered. I wonder why I didn't. No? Son of a gun.
Okay, are there any other?
No, I'm just, as we say down in the Southwest, pumping salt water.
Okay, well, if there are no other comments,
I'm signing off. That's 30.
Okay.